I've been working for a while now on a book tentatively entitled Building a Dwelling Place for God, the narthex portals at Vézelay and Ephesians 2:11-22 in medieval art. This book aims to reveal the existence of a strikingly sophisticated pictorial project that was explored and developed in a range of media and at an array of sites across Europe, and that stretched from the 5th to the mid-12th centuries. Over the course of 700 years, I've found this primarily monastic enterprise helped bring into being a remarkably large assortment of well-known works of art. What's more, it likely culminated in the so-called Gothic sculpted portal scheme that emerged in the Ile-de-France in the 1130s and 1140s, and that in its own right determined the character and structure of much monumental church sculpture in Europe for the remainder of the Middle Ages. At the center of my study is this great work of art, the main portal in the narthex of the monastic church of Saint-Madeleine de Vézelay in Burgundy, produced sometime in the first 3 decades of the 12th century. In the center of the tympanum, I hope you can see, an enormous figure of Christ disseminates the tongues of fire at Pentecost from his fingertips onto the heads of the apostles gathered on either side. There's Christ, the apostles here, and the tongues of fire there. The international witnesses of Pentecost, an event recounted in the Bible that's commonly understood as the founding moment of the church, appear enclosed within the surrounding architectural forms. Lintel blocks at the bottom, here and here, and voussoir-like compartments up each side following the round arch of the tympanum, here and here. At the top of the composition, the ends of these compartments frame Christ's head in a space shaped like a keystone. In the register below the tympanum, 6 apostles are depicted for a second time, here on the lateral faces of the trumeau and on the jambs. That's here, and then here and here. Placed on or beside pilasters, these figures are also assimilated into architecture. John the Baptist, finally, stands on the front of the trumeau, merged with a large column. On a disc in front of his chest, he holds the Lamb of God, the object of his famous prophecy. Behind the Baptist column appears a cross that both joins and supports the 2 lintel blocks on either side of the trumeau. There. This plethora of effectively fake, in the sense of being non-structural architectural motifs, I argue in my book, and I've published on this elsewhere as well, can be readily explained. They help the portal to visualize a conceptually rich passage full of architectural metaphors from one of Paul's letters in the New Testament, Ephesians 2:11-22. The verses of the passage most relevant to the portal are, "But now in Jesus Christ, you Gentiles, who once were far off, have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh he has made 2 groups, Jews and Gentiles, into one, and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of the 2, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross, thus putting to death that hostility through it. So he came and proclaimed peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through him both of us have access in one Spirit to the Father. So then, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints, and also members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the lapis angularis, literally the stone of the corner, but interpreted variously in the Middle Ages as foundation stone, cornerstone, keystone, or even capstone. In him the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God." On the portal, the lower register pictures the foundation of apostles and prophets mentioned in the passage by displaying apostles and the Baptist the last of the prophets, merged with vertical supports that appear to hold up the tympanum above. Their arrangement on either side of the two doorways also helps to visualize St. Augustine's important interpretation of these foundations as simultaneously portals into the heavenly city. The peripheral witnesses of Pentecost in the tympanum are presented as members of the household of God by being encased in lintel blocks and voussoir-like compartments. And Christ, in turn, is visualized as the text Lapis Angularis, who joins together the two communities of the universal church, at the top through his head as the keystone, and at the bottom through the cross as the foundation stone or cornerstone. Even the two communities of the church are represented. The peripheral figures are divided into Jews on the left, led by Peter, just to the left of Christ, here, and Gentiles on the right, led by Paul, seated immediately to the right of Christ, here. The Ephesians passage repeatedly urges its Gentile readers to join the church in a state of peace. This, too, is visualized by showing the leading figure on the right lintel hand his sword blade downward in an explicitly peaceful gesture to Peter and Paul, here represented for a second time just to the right of the trumeau. They embody the now unified church. So there's the sword, and he's standing here, and then Peter and Paul appear again right here. So the main portal at Vézelay fuses a depiction of Pentecost with a visualization of Ephesians 2:11-22, but it actually does more. That is, the portal, after featuring a gentle allusion to baptism through the presence of John the Baptist on the trumeau, functions on a third level as a vision of the public Mass, focused on the other key sacrament, the Eucharist. To summarize greatly, in this regard, the left lintel shows the offertory procession of the people. The right lintel shows the lay congregation's communion or peace procession in the moments before its actual reception of the Eucharist. And the Eucharist itself is evoked by the Lamb and the cross on the trumeau, the motifs of the Cornerstone foundation stone, remember, which are located directly on axis with the main altar at the other end of the nave. The apostles of the inner tympanum, in turn, surrounded by the living stones of the faithful in the lintels and archivolt compartments, are an image of the monks in the round-arched choir that at the time would have enclosed that altar, involved in the act of performing the liturgy. Christ, finally, the keystone that unites the two arching walls of believers into a single household of God, is the Abbot Priest, the celebrant of the Mass, involved in distributing his literally edifying blessings to the awaiting congregation. The portal then, by functioning as a portrait of the public Mass, as well as a visualization of Pentecost in Ephesians 2:11-22, would have rendered the barrier between biblical history and contemporary reality at Vézelay filament thin. And by accomplishing such a feat of bridging between past and present, the eternal and the temporal, the universal and the local, the heavenly and the earthly, the portal must have brought great comfort to the original viewers of the sculptural program, convincing them that their activities within the Basilica, and not just the act of entering that sacred space, were part of a divinely ordained plan for their salvation. Now, my current book project came into being only after making these discoveries at Vézelay. That is, I began to search around for possible precedents to this scheme, not expecting to find much, to be honest, and really just with the goal of introducing my claims concerning the portal. Much to my surprise, however, I began to find work of art after work of art that visualized key aspects of Ephesians 2:11-22 and that pertained directly in its imagery and larger aims to the sculpture at Vézelay. Moreover, these findings kept moving the origins of what I was coming to realize was a specific, identifiable tradition of theological picture-making rooted in the Ephesians passage further and further back in time, indeed to the very beginning of monumental art in Christendom. What I want to discuss today is my most recent discovery in this regard, which I believe is one of the earliest realizations of the project. I hope that my synopsis of what's going on at Vézelay will help you understand what's to follow. And as you'll see fairly quickly, there are numerous connections between the work we're going to investigate and this portal. These connections are important, but teasing them out and explaining their implications would require more time than we have. Rather, my goal in presenting this newest research is to demonstrate, in the form of a case study, if you will, the extraordinary possibilities of this medieval tradition of visualizing the Ephesians passage and of materializing its metaphors in particular, for activating symbolically the entire physical environment of the sanctuary as a means of shaping and thereby giving the greatest possible devotional depth to the experience of communal worship by the individual faithful within the church. The monument I'm going to be talking about, which I have to admit up front no longer exists, alas, a frequent medieval problem, is the Basilica complex built and decorated by Pontius Meropius Paulinus at Nola, just east of Naples. Paulinus of Nola, as he's commonly known, was a highly educated Roman aristocrat from Aquitania who had once been governor of Campania, the Roman province in which Nola was located. Baptized in Spain in 389, Paulinus dedicated himself to the monastic life in 394. In 395, he moved with his wife back to Nola and began establishing an ascetic community there around the shrine of St. Felix. As part of his efforts, Paulinus embarked on a lavish building campaign that included expanding and refurbishing the existing basilica at the cult site, building a new one at right angles to it, and joining the two basilicas by way of a porticoed atrium. So the new basilica here, the old one here, the atrium here. This plan, by the way, is based on the best and most recent archaeological evidence, and it's something I'll continue to discuss as I move through my talk. Much is known about the construction program at Nola, probably begun in the year 400 and completed by 403, in part because of the archaeological remains at the site, but also because Paulinus, unusually for the early Christian or medieval periods, wrote a great deal about it. His engagement with Ephesians 2:11-22 is found in one of these accounts, his so-called Letter 32, likely datable to 403 and addressed to another Roman patrician turned Christian ascetic, Sulpicius Severus, who ran his own monastic foundation in southern France known as Primiliacum. This complex document, written by one intellectual to another but intended really like a sermon to be circulated within and contemplated by the larger monastic community, reads on one level, I would argue, as an extended discourse on the Ephesians passage. The ostensible motivation for the letter seems to have been a request by Severus for inscriptions designed to accompany portraits Severus had commissioned of Paulinus and another man to be hung in his own new baptistry at Primiliacum, a baptistry built between one equally new and one refurbished basilica. After providing these inscriptions, Paulinus offers Severus a number of additional verses for the basilical complex at Primiliacum, including 2 poems about the baptistry itself. Paulinus then includes several inscriptions from his new basilical complex at Nola. He does this, he explains, at the behest of their letter carrier, Victor, who has argued that, in the spirit of exchange, and to effect a true communion of souls between the two correspondents, information about building projects sent by Severus should be matched by information sent in the other direction by Paulinus. The theme that threads its way through much of Letter 32 and cues its contents to the Ephesians passage is that of multiplicity into unity. As at Vézelay, the equation most frequently at play is that of 2 into 1. But again, as at Vézelay, where the large Christ figure is actually a personification of the Trinity, for reasons too complicated to explain here, the equation of 3 into 1 is also often evoked. As Paulinus tells Severus in the opening paragraph, establishing a pattern for the whole, Their separate acts of church building at Nola and Primuliacum happily unite them. Quote, I am delighted that we have together exhibited the one appearance of heart and body, and of works and dedications as well, by simultaneously bestowing built basilicas on the Lord's folds. That such a comment would have caused Severus to recall the Ephesians passage, and thus to have it fresh in his mind as he embarked on the reading of the rest of the letter, is suggested by the fact that Paulinus had actually quoted a key verse from that passage in earlier letters to Severus in order to make similar points about the binding nature of the two friends' shared religious commitment. In letter 5, for example, written around 396, Paulinus states, quote, Christ makes men of one manner to dwell in a house, and I hope he will make us, meaning Paulinus and Severus, dwell together in him. And here he paraphrases Ephesians 2:14, quote, for he has made both one, end quote. A little later in letter 32, in the second of his two poems written about the baptistry at Primuliacum, Paulinus uses the theme of 2 as well as 3 into 1 to celebrate both Severus's efforts as a builder and the layout of the latter's basilical complex. Quote, Severus, most chaste of Christ's dwellers in body, mind, and faith, has in joy built this house, that is, his baptistry, for God. He is himself wholly a temple of God, and thrives with Christ as his guest. And just as he worships one mind under 3 names, so here he has dedicated a 3-fold work of sacred building, that is, the 2 basilicas and the baptistry. On the twin structures, that is, the 2 basilicas, he has set for his people splendid roofs so that their number might harmonize with the sacred laws. For just as the one proposer stipulated 2 testaments, joining Christ with God in the one faith, so Severus has set his baptistry with tower-shaped dome between 2 churches. The twin-roofed basilicas represent the church, or the capital C, with her 2 testaments. The single baptistry, lending grace, adjoins both. The old law strengthens the new fulfills the old. Christ's grace combines old and new, so the baptistry is placed between the 2. End quote. This theme of 2 and 3 into 1 arises in numerous other instances as well within the first section, too numerous, unfortunately, to quote here. And the point of its frequent iteration becomes clear in Paulinus' subsequent account of his own inscriptions at Nola. Letter 32 presents 17 inscriptions from the 2 basilicas, including one for the Apse Mosaic in the new Basilica of the Apostles, down here, one for that basilica's main altar, would have been just in front here, and 9 for the 2 churches' triple-arched entranceways that seem to have faced each other across a central atrium. And here I'm showing you 2 reconstructions by the reigning archaeological authority of the site of the new basilica here with its apse and altar, and you can see the position you're seeing it from here in the plan. And down here, the 2 triple entranceways seen from standing in the new basilica looking that way. As mentioned, the churches were oriented at right angles to each other, with the old basilica dedicated to St. Felix, BV, this one here, lying west to east, and the new basilica, BN, south to north. This layout meant that the triple-arched entrance into the new basilica was on the short south wall of the church. So here, opposite to and on axis with the main altar and apse at the north end. The triple-arched entrance into the old basilica, however, right here, was cut into one of the church's long sides, the north wall at its west end. While this newly created entrance, therefore, was not on axis with the old altar's main altar at the east end, down here, it did open onto the tomb of Felix, right about here. located near the basilica's west wall. The two triple-arched entrances, as a result, not only join the two basilicas to the porticoed atrium, again right here, establishing on the ground another example of the theme of 2 and 3 into 1, but they also created a clear view all the way from the new church's altar and apse to the old church's primary cult space, Felix's tomb. As Paulinus explains his changes, quote, "It is a splendid sight, the way in which the new basilica suddenly, in its entirety, opens in the direction of the old basilica in 3 similar arches, pervious to light, by which the buildings and the spaces of the two churches are connected." Then he adds, his new situation creates, quote, "a vista, which might be called open work, from one church into the other, as is indicated by the inscriptions placed between the 2 rows of gates," end quote. These inscriptions, Paulinus makes clear, were located above each arch of the entranceways on the exterior of the new basilica and on both the exterior and interior of the old basilica for a total of 9. And you can see them labeled on the plan from G to O. The longest one, J, which I've identified here, appeared above the central arch of the entrance into the old basilica, facing into the atrium, and so also toward the new basilica. It is this inscription that paraphrases parts of Ephesians 2:11-22, and it is also this inscription that returns the reader of letter 32 explicitly to the theme of 2 into 1. The pivotal importance of inscription J to the overall program of Entranceway tituli is indicated by its central position and its unparalleled length, but also by the fact that it is the first of the old basilica's 6 entrance inscriptions cited by Paulinus. He devotes a few lines to describing the inscription setting before quoting the text itself. Quote, "With this lattice," that is the triple-arched entrance into the old basilica, however, "by which that short distance which, properly speaking, used to separate the neighboring churches, now forms a continuous whole, there are in the direction of the new basilica over the central arch these verses." You have them up here. "As Jesus, our peace, has broken down the middle of the wall of partition, and destroying the division through the cross, has made both one, so we see that the new edifices, as a result of the partitioning old building having been demolished, are joined by a union of arches. A radiant fountain flows between the sacred halls with serving waters and washes the hands of those entering with a ministering stream. The congregation worships Christ in the double hall of Felix, which Bishop Paul dominates with his apostolic words." In paraphrasing Ephesians 2:14, the inscription, for those in the know, like Severus, implicitly likens the 2 basilicas at Nola to the Jews and the Gentiles. Such an analogy enables Paulinus to characterize his monastic complex in a manner similar to how he had characterized Severus's earlier in letter 32, when he described the 2 basilicas at Primulliacum as representing the Old and New Testaments. This parallel certainly stresses the unity of design and purpose in the 2 friends' building enterprises. Both are creating a unified whole out of the old and the new. But just as significantly, it also indicates that Paulinus is presenting his own complex at Nola as likewise figuring the church, capital C. Moreover, the parallel imbues the fountain mentioned in the second half of the inscription and that was located in the center of the atrium between the basilicas at Nola with allusions to the baptismal font, given that at Primulliacum it was a baptistry rather than an atrium that joined the 2 churches into one. Even the words used to refer to the fountain in inscription J subtly call to mind the baptismal font, in that the fountain is described as flowing with serving waters and washing with a ministering stream. The intent of the baptismal analogy in inscription J, in turn, was surely to emphasize that the unifying power of Jesus, our peace, in other words, Christ, the lapis angularis' knowledge of both Ephesians 2:11-22 and the contents of letter 32 itself in its entirety would ultimately have made clear, is to be found in the daily life of the church, capital C, / these basilicas, in the form of the two main sacraments, baptism and the Eucharist. That the Eucharist was also being alluded to in this manner in the inscriptions is evident not only by way of the inscription's reference to the cross as the agent of unification, but also by the titulus's very placement. Located above the main arch into the old basilica, but facing into the atrium, it was essentially on axis both with the main altar of the new basilica beyond the atrium and with what was likely, as I'll soon discuss, a giant cross in the center of the Apse mosaic directly behind that altar. So I'm talking about the axis that joins J ultimately to this area. The next four entranceway inscriptions from the old basilica, cited by Paulinus, pick up on the Ephesians-inspired theme of 2 into 1 as a way of developing further the metaphorical association of Paulinus's basilical complex with the universal church and the lapis angularis, which I'll refer to from here on as the cornerstone for convenience's sake, but which can always connote, it's worth remembering, any of the stones I've mentioned. More specifically, the other four entranceway inscriptions likewise allude to the union of the two basilicas into one grand house of worship, but they identify a variety of different witnesses to and beneficiaries of that union. Inscription K, to begin, located on the arch just to the left of inscription J, presents the experience of union from the point of view of the individual believer visiting Paulinus's complex. To dazed eyes, a new light opens, and he who stands on one threshold beholds two halls simultaneously. The new light, in literal terms, is that which now passes through the triple-arched entranceways and illuminates the interiors of the two basilicas for the benefit of the visitor standing on the threshold. That new light, however, is also surely to be understood as Christ, quote, the true light which enlightens everyone, and that's from the Gospel of John, and which here inhabits and enlightens the individual viewer, thereby allowing him or her to appreciate the unity of the whole. An intended consequence of this characterization is that the viewer is rendered basilica-like, as similarly filled with light. In inscription L, in turn, just to the right of inscription J, the equation is reversed. That is, the basilicas themselves are given the power of a human Christ-inhabited viewer to experience and appreciate unity. Through a group of three arches, two halls are accessible, and they admire each other's adornment over one another's thresholds. On the interior wall of the facade of the old basilica, the central inscription M shifts the focus yet again by imbuing the congregation as a whole by way of its movement through the complex with the ability to enjoy the two basilicas here described as courts as one devotional space. You whose devout faith induces you to revere Blessed Felix in dense throngs from different entrances, pour your dispersed crowds in through the triple entry. Any multitude will find room in the spacious courts, which are closely connected with one another by open arches and which are consecrated to eternal use by Paulus the bishop. The message to the congregation to experience the two as one is expressed more pithily and pointedly in inscription N, to the left of M. You, in the plural, who go from the old church of Holy Felix cross to Felix's new edifice. By way of their content and alterations in point of view, then, these 5 entranceway inscriptions present, albeit with the great subtlety characteristic of the highly literary Paulinus, the individual, the congregation, and the actual structures enclosing the congregation, that is, the 2 basilicas at Nola, as mystically one with the universal church, and as each, like the universal church, made whole by Christ, implicitly in his guise as the cornerstone. As inscription J indicates at the outset of the sequence, the facilitators of this unity, in the context of the activities conducted within the spaces surrounding the inscriptions, are the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. The 6th and final titulus above the entrance into the old basilica cited by Paulinus, inscription O, in turn identifies another essential agent of unification, that is, another catalyst of the power of the cornerstone. That agent is faith, and more specifically, making deeper sense of the sub-theme of 3 into 1 expressed throughout letter 32, faith in the triune Godhead. The one faith, which worships one God under 3 names, takes up those who are one in spirit through 3 entrances. The inscriptions above the triple-arched entrance into the old basilica, the evidence indicates, present a discourse on the ties that bind together the individual Christian, the congregation at Nola, the complex's 2 basilicas, the universal church, Christ as the cornerstone, the sacraments, and proper faith. In so doing, these inscriptions in fact complement, by either interacting with or effectively recapitulating, the claims made even more elusively in the inscriptions and sacred objects found in the new basilica, discussed by Paulinus in letter 32, immediately before his account of the inscriptions of the old basilica. The key to the program of the new basilica, as articulated in letter 32, is its Apse mosaic, or rather, the inscription of the Apse mosaic, which is the only information concerning this large composition provided by Paulinus. And you see it, the inscription there, the Apse mosaic up there, the altar there. As he states, quote, the apse, which has a floor and walls of marble, is made bright by a vault, pleasantly decorated with mosaics, the painting of which bears the following verses. In full mystery sparkles the Trinity. Christ stands as Lamb, the voice of the Father thunders from heaven, and in the form of a dove, the Holy Spirit flows down. The cross is surrounded by a wreath, a bright circle, around which wreath the apostles form again a wreath, the image of whom is expressed in a chorus of doves. The holy unity of the Trinity meets in Christ, who likewise has his insignia in threefold, being revealed as God by the fatherly voice and the Spirit, the cross and the Lamb testifying him as the sacred sacrificed one, kingdom and triumph being indicated by the purple and the palm. He himself, the rock of the church, is standing on a rock, from which 4 seething springs issue. The evangelists, the living streams of Christ. As Paulinus clearly wished Severus, the other anticipated readers of letter 32, and all visitors to Nola to know, because the opening words of the inscription declare it to be so, the mosaic presented a vision of the Trinity. This vision would have functioned as a kind of materialization and thus validation of the proper faith evoked not just in inscription O, located above the southern arch on the interior facade of the old basilica, but also in inscription G, located above the central arch on the exterior facade of the new basilica. The nourishing house is open with triple arch to those entering, and this threefold doorway bears testimony to pious faith. Indeed, these three inscriptions, O, G, and the Apse titulus, could all theoretically have been glimpsed at the same time by someone standing just inside the entrance to the old basilica and looking across the atrium into the new church. So if you're standing here, you could see O, G, and the Apse titulus at the same time. This arrangement was surely intended by Paulinus both to stress the relatedness of the three inscriptions, as well as the Apse composition itself, and thus the two basilicas as a whole, and to create a directional focus echoing inscription N from old to new, from the existing sanctuary dedicated to Felix to the brand new one dedicated to the apostles. When considered together, moreover, these three inscriptions and the Apse mosaic imbue the architecture of the two basilicas with profound symbolic value. The entranceways with their triple arches come to stand for proper faith, while entry through them, as inscriptions O and G make clear, comes to signify the taking within oneself of this faith. The Apse inscription and mosaic, by extension, become a revelation of that faith within the individual believer's soul. This interaction of architecture, text, and image, in other words, renders the two basilicas as the symbolic equivalents of the individual believer. As has already been seen, this equivalence is also hinted at in the old basilica's program of entrance inscriptions, which describe both the individual and the two basilicas as filled with light, and thereby constitutes another level of dialogue between the decoration schemes of the two houses of worship at Nola. The new basilica's Apse inscription and mosaic, however, do further symbolic work relevant to the old basilica's Ephesians-inspired program of entrance inscriptions, especially in terms of the relationship of the congregation to the sacraments and of both to the cornerstone. To understand how, it will be worth trying to reconstruct the new basilica's Apse composition, a gesture seemingly encouraged by Paulinus himself in letter 32, through his tantalizing inclusion of the lengthy descriptive titulus for the mosaic, but nothing more. The inscription leaves the exact details of the Apse composition open to a certain degree of interpretation, but the majority of scholars have accepted Wyckoff's reconstruction, produced over 100 years ago, as the most persuasive. You're seeing it here. The content of the verses, however, especially when considered in light of surviving Apse compositions of the period, strongly suggest that the Apse composition in the new basilica featured 1. Some kind of large cross enclosed within a wreath-like medallion. Quote, the cross is surrounded by a wreath, a bright circle, end quote. 2. The hand of God in clouds above. Quote, the voice of the Father thunders from heaven, end quote. And 3, a dove below. Quote, in the form of a dove, the Holy Spirit flows down, end quote. The mosaic also likely included, directly below the axial hand-dove cross arrangement of motifs, a lamb standing on a rock with 4 rivulets. Quote, Christ stands as lamb, the cross and the lamb testifying him as the sacred sacrificed one, and he himself, the rock of the church, is standing on a rock from which 4 seething springs issue. Although the inscription doesn't mention this detail explicitly, finally, scholars from Wyckoff on have tended to include 6 more lambs on either side of the central rock and lamb at the bottom of the composition, and they've done this for a number of reasons. First, such an arrangement was commonplace in early Christian Apse schemes, especially in the influential and nearby city of Rome. Second, the arrangement's symbolic value as a vision of Christ and the 12 apostles, and thus of the original church, would have been consonant with the meaning of other verses within the inscription, and thus of other motifs in the mosaic. For example, the arrangement would have mirrored, with roughly the same signification, the 12 apostles' the 12 doves as apostles that encircle the large cross above. Quote, "The cross is surrounded by a wreath, around which the apostles again form a wreath, the image of whom is expressed in a chorus of doves," end quote. Third, the very epithet rock of the church, Petra Ecclesiae, has a built-in ambiguity that the arrangement of the lamb on the rock, flanked by 12 other lambs, would have captured. That is, the epithet can be interpreted in two slightly different ways, as signifying Christ alone, that is, the rock belonging to the church, or as signifying Christ and the apostles, that is, as the rock that is, collectively, the church. The Apse Mosaic, by way of its inscription, then, seems to identify the cross and the lamb as signs of Christ in his sacrificial form, and likens both motifs as well to Christ as the rock of the church. The wording of the inscription, however, multiplies the ambiguity of this latter phrase by describing the rock of the church as both Christ and the support for Christ. Quote, "The rock of the church is standing on a rock," end quote. This second level of ambiguity would have allowed the mosaic itself, if our reconstruction, including the frieze of lambs at the bottom, is fundamentally accurate, to be read in two ways. As a vision of the rock of the church supporting the Lamb of Christ, or as a vision of the Lamb of Christ and the Lamb apostles along with the hillock or the rock below as collectively the rock of the church, supporting Christ as the cross above. Either way, the mosaic would have mirrored visually the arrangement directly below and in front of it of the altar supporting the Eucharist. That this visual correspondence was intentional and freighted with meaning is made clear by the contents of the altar, which Linus describes in letter 32 in another inscription, located, he says, on the wall beneath the Apse mosaic. The inscription indicates that the altar contained, and indeed joined together, a fragment of the true cross and relics of the apostles. And I've got here the holy altar enwraps a double gift of honor to God, as it brings together with the cross the ashes of the apostles. In other words, just as the mosaic seems to have done, the main altar of the new basilica presented Christ with the rest of the church, that is, Christ in the form of the true cross fragment, gathered with his apostles in the form of their ashes, supporting Christ the sacrifice in the form of the Eucharist, but as a material reality through the relics in the altar and the Eucharist on the altar, rather than as a mere representation. The consequences of this dialogue between the altar and the apse, in terms of the deeper meanings of the apse inscription and imagery, is to unite the mosaic's symbolic depiction of Christ and the apostles as a vision of both the original and the universal church with this very church, its sacred objects and ritual activities, and its congregation. Indeed, the symbolic bond between the vision of the church, capital C, in the Apse mosaic on the one hand, and both the altar and the members of the congregation at Nola on the other, is actually made explicit and given a powerful affective dimension in the two lateral entrance inscriptions for the new basilica, H and I. These verses flanked the central inscription G, concerning proper faith in the Trinity, creating a situation where all three entrance tituli alluded to the Apse mosaic and to related objects and activities within the basilica. The lateral inscriptions each featured painted red lead crosses beside them. I've added them for effect here. According to Linus, setting up an immediate affiliation between the tituli and the cross-related imagery of the apse, as well as the Eucharist on the altar and the true crossed fragment within the altar. What's more, both entrance tituli discuss doves. Inscription H remarks on the position of the doves around the cross and emphasizes both their simple virtue and their saved status. The high cross is surrounded by the rounding of a flower-bearing wreath and is red, dyed by the Lord's shed blood. The doves perched above the heavenly sign intimate that the kingdom of God is open to the simple of heart. Inscription I, in turn, changes voice to the first person plural, and thereby becomes a plea being made directly to Christ by all those entering the church. Slay us unto the world with this cross, and the world unto us, by virtue of your giving life to our soul through the downfall of guilt. Us too will you make doves pleasing to thee, Christ, if your followers have strength through purity of heart. The apostle doves of the Mosaic, then, are also the congregants of the new Basilica, or at least those amongst the congregation who will manage to remain strong and pure enough to merit a positive response from Christ to the entrance titulus's request. What all of these inscriptions do together as a result, that is H, I, and those of the apse and altar, is to lock ever more tightly at Nola the universal to the local, the historically distant world of the Bible to the here and now. The motif of the rock of the church in the apse mosaic of the new basilica, however, was carefully tied by Linus to its immediate architectural and ritual setting in yet further ways. As the apse inscription states, 4 rivulets flow from the rock, and these signify, quote, the evangelists, the living streams of Christ. And you see those here in this reconstruction. This verse undoubtedly alludes to the spreading of the word of Christ through the 4 Gospels, and thus, in this physical context, surely also to the regular recitation of the Gospels during the liturgy, conducted by the clergy right in front of the mosaic. Indeed, the verse may even have been intended to allude to the actual presence of a copy of the Gospels on the altar of the new basilica, sharing space with the Eucharist. If such allusions to the Gospels in the liturgy were active, the motif of the 4 streams would have helped to reinforce the point that the rock of the church and its related imagery in the mosaic was a vision not just of the church in its original apostolic form, but also of the church today, and indeed this very congregation made up of both the clergy and the visiting faithful at Nola. The metaphor of Christ as the rock, however, ultimately derives from 1 Corinthians 10:1-4, a derivation that imbues the mosaic with yet further symbolic value. This passage characterizes Christ as the rock from which Moses miraculously drew water to save his people. Quote, our ancestors were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. End quote. The allusion to baptism here is clear. The waters from the rock provide those entering the church with eternal spiritual refreshment. The passage, however, also mentions spiritual food, a reference to the miracle of the manna, the bread from heaven that fed the Israelites in the desert immediately before the miraculous coming of the water, according to the account in the book of Exodus. This Old Testament confluence of saving food and drink in relation to the rock led Christian commentators to use the metaphor of Christ as the rock of the church to evoke both the Eucharist and baptism. Indeed, Linus himself explains the metaphor in exactly this way in another letter, known as Letter 42, addressed to Florentius of Cahors. Quote, that rock serves us in the desert of this world with unfailing waters, so that we are not consumed with the heat of bodily desires. This is the rock on which the firmly built house does not fall. This is the rock which flowed with water and blood when his side was pierced with a lance, so that he poured forth for us 2 streams equally saving, the water of grace and the blood of the sacrament. In other words, both the source of our salvation and its price, end quote. The depiction in the mosaic of the Lamb and cross above the rock from which waters flow would have captured this dual sacramental reference effectively. The sacramental associations of Christ as the rock in the Apse Mosaic, finally, are also enormously significant in the context of the old Basilica's Ephesians-inspired program of entrance inscriptions, because the multivalent metaphor of the rock, of course, calls to mind as well that of Christ the cornerstone. That the motif of the rock described in the Apse Mosaic inscription was intended by Paulinus to evoke the cornerstone is confirmed by the fact that toward the end of letter 32, as we'll see in a moment, Paulinus identifies Christ the cornerstone specifically as the rock of the church. Even without this hard evidence, however, the association of the rock and the cornerstone is a natural and obvious one, given the identity in materials. Indeed, it is hinted at by Paulinus himself in the passage from letter 42 I just cited. There he describes the rock in distinctly cornerstone-like terms, that is, as that, quote, on which the firmly built house does not fall, end quote. What's more, and this is a point I made earlier but that's worth stressing, the association was suggested by the very layout of the churches and their inscriptions at Nola. That is, inscription J, with its mention of the cross, the ministering streams of the atrium fountain, and its evocation of the cornerstone through its paraphrasing of Ephesians 2:14, was placed above the central entranceway of the old basilica on its exterior facade, just to remind you here. As a result, it faced and was located directly on axis with not just the altar and the apse of the new basilica, but also the presumably centrally aligned motifs of the mosaic, the cross, the lamb, and the rock with its four streams. By way of their complex interaction, in summary, the entrance inscription J on the old basilica and the apse inscription and mosaic in the new basilica, in conjunction with the sacred objects within and upon the altar of the new basilica, stress, admittedly in subtle symbolic fashion, the sacramental significance of the cornerstone. In so doing, they serve to unite the two basilicas in a manner that deepens the bond created by the two-into-one theme articulated in so many of the old basilica's entrance inscriptions, and by the matching and facing triple-arched entranceways, along with the related Trinitarian inscriptions and imagery we've discussed. Moreover, inscription J and the apse titulus and mosaic together create a scenario in which the cornerstone, or allusions to it, are found in spatial terms at the beginning and end of Paulinus's program of inscriptions, as described in letter 32. That is, at the southernmost point, the entrance into the old basilica, here, and at the northernmost point, the apse wall of the new basilica, here. They are also located effectively at the top and bottom of these structures, at the summit of the arch of the central entranceway into the old basilica in regard to inscription J, and at the base of the apse mosaic in the new basilica in regard to the motif of the rock. If the altar with the Eucharist is also included in this scenario, then the allusions to the cornerstone in the new basilica extend even further down onto the floor of the basilica itself. This arrangement evocatively materializes a claim made by Paulinus at the end of letter 32, in which he also finally identifies Christ explicitly as the cornerstone, associates him with the rock of the church, and describes that rock in a manner that calls to mind the apse mosaic. Quote, "Let us pray that through these present tabernacles of the church," that is, these real physical buildings, "we may go into the house of God, where dwells our highest Lord himself, the cornerstone made for us by the Lord, the stone hewn from the mountain and grown into a mountain, which is wonderful in our eyes. May he offer himself to our building, both as its foundation and its top, for he is the beginning and the end. I pray that on this rock, for Christ too is the rock, without which no man can build a steady house, our hands may not heap stubble." End quote. The entire new sacred basilica, Nola, then, is being figured in letter 32 as Christ, and indeed as the cornerstone into which the faithful can build themselves. And, as we've discussed, the focus at Nola in this regard, as at Vézelay 7 centuries later, was participation in the Mass, embarked upon in the spirit of proper faith and only after the benefits of baptism had been acquired. The central act of the Mass, in turn, was the taking of the Eucharist, that is, the true union of the individual believer with God, shared and witnessed by the community of fellow worshippers. As we've seen, Linus uses key metaphors from Ephesians 2:11-22 from the cornerstone out to transform his basilical complex at Nola into a single, coherent, multimedia composition. Here, there is no distinction amongst the arts. Rather, inscriptions, images, architecture, sacred objects, and ritual, effectively everything from bodies to buildings, are made to work together in a seamless whole to express and then play out the implications of this Eucharistic joining of the human and the divine. One can speculate that at the level of conception, this was the aim of most public church art and architecture in the Middle Ages. What makes these visualizations of the Ephesians passage so interesting and so important to us is that they are able to show with tremendous clarity and force just how such symbolically charged and devotionally rich mise-en-scènes, if you will, could be created. What the people on the ground actually thought of all of this is hard to know. But the very fact that the visualizing of this passage continued and that information about these visualizations seems to have been repeatedly passed on from Nola ultimately to Vézelay and then beyond suggests that somehow someone thought it was working. Thank you.